Assalamu alaikum, you're watching Views and News and I'm Faisal Rehman live from our Islamabad studios. Today we'll be talking about a very important topic, and that is about the growing tension between the United States of America and Russia. The latest news is that the United States has expelled another 27 Russian diplomats, and when you look at the overall number since 2016, that is around close to 100. Now that's a big number. Well, there were many issues between these two giants, I would say, and whether you talk about the issue in Russia, Crimea, or you talk about Ukraine, you talk about the Black Sea, you talk about Syria, you talk about Afghanistan, you talk about the cyber attacks which the Americans claim that the Russians have done, you talk about the spying or meddling in the US elections of 2016 when Donald Trump came into power, or otherwise when you talk about NATO and their presence. So there were a lot of issues. And on top, the moment the American president takes charge, I still remember the first statement that was delivered was about a very interesting phenomena. And the president stated that there are two adversaries, two enemies of America. One is China, one is Russia. So lines have been drawn. Alignments are there now. A lot of, I would say, changes are in the process, and a lot will be happening in the future also. But before we start talking about it and we throw light on the actual issues and what sort of result can they bring in, we have prepared a report. Let's watch that, and after that I'll introduce you to our guests and we'll start about.
27 Russian diplomats and their families were expelled from the United States and are going to leave the United States on 30th January 2021 as the tensions between Russia and the United States are increasing with every passing day. Most recently, political tensions between the United States and Russia heightened due to the Ukrainian issue and the imposition of the sanctions by the United States on Russia regarding Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline. The United States opposes the $11 billion pipeline, which it believes will make Europe too reliant on the Russian gas. Earlier, multiple United States officials cited serious concerns regarding Russia's unusual military activity along its border with Ukraine. Spokesperson of the United States State Department Ned Price asserted that Washington is in consultation with its European partners and with Ukraine in this regard. He claimed that we are prepared and preparing for a number of contingencies. Previously, the senior-most United States and Ukrainian generals spoke twice within 4 days to share perspectives and assessments of the evolving security environment in Eastern Europe. These consultations between the Ukrainian and the United States generals were followed by the phone call of senior-most United States General, Chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff, Mark Milley, with his Russian counterpart, in which they discussed several security-related issues of concern. According to the Pentagon, this call was a continuation of communication between both leaders to ensure risk reduction and operational deconfliction. Russian media reports claimed that Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu said that Moscow was witnessing a considerable increase in the United States' strategic bombers activity near the Russian borders.
Now to talk about it, let me quickly introduce you to our panelists. We have with us in our studio, on my right is Brigadier retired Shahid Jagir Saab. He's a defense analyst. Sir, thank you so much for your time. And we also have with us Dr. Ziaul Haq Saab, Director CAS. Thank you so much, sir, for your time. And on Skype from Germany, we have with us Helga-Zepp Larouche. She is the founder of Schiller Institute. Thank you so much, ma'am, for your time. Pleasure to have you on the show as well. Now, let me start off from you, Brigadier Saab. The interesting part is that this is not the first time that the Americans have expelled a certain number of diplomats. This started in 2016, if you remember, right after the election when Donald Trump became the president. And they did talk about these cyber attacks, then they mentioned about meddling in their elections, and perhaps the Russians were blamed for making sure that Mr. Donald Trump should become the president. He eventually became the president. Or you talk about the Syrian issue, Afghanistan issue, the moment the Russians started engaging the Taliban, or you talk about Crimea, you talk about Ukraine. Now Ukraine is asking for help against Russia from the NATO. And there is a long list, sir. Oil prices and perhaps issues related to the Baltic states. This tension has been going on for quite some time, sir. Whether you talk about banning the Russian athletes from taking part in the Olympics, or you talk about, again, criticizing the Russian spies for killings of certain individuals in UK, if you remember, so that was also another area that was, perhaps I would call that, bone of contention. Americans have very categorically mentioned, sir, that there are two adversaries. One is China, makes sense, and one is Russia, was, is, and will remain. How do you see this equation now?
Thank you very much. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. If you see the history, after the Second World War, the Britain was offered a Marshall Plan, a big loan, which was the most of the Americans were not interested that this should materialize. But it materialized, and the reason given for that was that if the capitalist will not do it, the communist will do it. You know, and you see after that, after the Second World War, the world has always remained divided into two forces. One is the liberal force or the capitalist, and the others are the authoritarian, neo authoritarian, whatever you call. The first one are the Europeans and the Americans, and the later ones are the Chinese and the Russians. One. Second, there is no doubt in the military standpoint of view, the technological point of view, the space or the cyber point of view, the most modern are Americans and the Russians. I mean, they are competing with each other, followed by the Americans, followed by the Chinese. So this is a race to dominate the world. But the problem is that the NATO or the European countries are dependent on Russia as far as their gas is concerned.
Yeah, energy primarily.
Yeah, energy primarily. Oil is concerned, and they cannot afford to leave it as such, or to confront the Americans openly. The second thing is that the Americans, if you see from the last 2 decades, the American power is declining. Economically, you know, China has taken lead on that. Technologically, China has gone far ahead in artificial intelligence.
Indeed, sir, they are far ahead.
Facial recognition and, you know, other these IT dominant technologies. It has made a great progress in the space technological advancement, and same is the case with the Russia also. So there is now a time is probably is to come where America will try to maintain its dominance, try to maintain its dominance of the world. Whereas on the other hand, what they call is the neo authoritarians like the China and Russians, they will try to compete them. China is far ahead in economy and in you know, following the Russians in the military power. They are going to have the fourth fleet also. So in the time to come, the reality is that if these three powers and the European Union would not make a very wise decision.
And when you say wise decision, what exactly is that supposed to mean, Brigadier Saab?
Sorry?
What do you exactly mean by the wise decisions?
I mean,
not to meddle in Russian affairs?
They talk of, liberal world order, what you call is they talk of human rights, they talk of the free speech, they talk of democracy. But on the other hand, when you see, it is a liberal world which is sponsoring the colored revolution. It is a liberal world which is interfering and trying for a regime change on the name of human rights, on the name of freedom of speech on the name of social media and press media liberty. So, what I mean to say is that what they call is the rule-based world order. This is the rule-based world order as dictated by the US, and not the rule-based world order as dictated by the UN Charter, as dictated by the norms of the humanity, which you have seen the massacre which has been done in Syria, in Iraq, in Afghanistan. So, these are the tools, and as you have very rightly pointed out right on the first speech of Biden, he has also said this thing, that human rights and freedom of speech are the two tools which will be used to shape the world. A verse to these effect, he said. So, that means that these are the leading reasons for the colored revolution, the regime change which they used to do it with the force of power. And you have also, world has also witnessed that it was only when the Russians intervened in Syria that the onslaught of the Americans was stopped or checked to a little.
That's indeed, sir. Now, coming to you, sir. First of all, you still believe that, when we talk about the capitalism versus, when we talk about the Russian kind of, mindset of communist approach, don't you think, sir, Russians have also, shown a certain tilt towards capitalism now? Things are changing. Earlier, as mentioned by Brigadier Saab, that, the Russians are very orthodox. And indeed, they are Orthodox Christians. I mean, if you look at it, I mean, even if you talk about the civilizations from Sino to the Western, to the Russians, to the Mongols, all the way down into the Indian, and so on and so forth, Muslim for that matter. How do you see that equation, sir? Are they changing? Are they changing for good or no?
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Thank you very much. Actually, world is changing. And the world is changing in a different manner this time. And perhaps this is the first time that the poles are being defined very, very clearly. It was only before the World War I that there were a number of empires and poles. But post World War I, Treaty of Versailles, and subsequently post World War II, there were only two poles or two powers. And the lines were clearly drawn between Eastern Europe and Western Europe, one superpower and the other superpower, and the two systems, the capitalism and communism. They were very clear. Now,
Germany was a perfect example.
Now the things are very blurred. It is evolving. New world order is being revised. And Russia has a role to play in that. While the American influence is declining because of its engagement, prolonged engagement in Afghanistan, during which China's rise has been unchecked. Russia has also recovered within this time from the loss it had suffered in Afghanistan. Okay? So now this is for the first time perhaps in last more than 100 years that there are three competing powers. Europeans are no more power. Asia other than China is no more power. So, and interestingly, Russia and China are collaborating very closely through the Shanghai Cooperation Organization.
SCO, yeah.
And that is why America, if you see, is running around different poles to get the allies. Look at where Australia is and what kind of role Australia can play. And America wants to engage Australia as one of the important corners through AUKUS. isn't it? Look at Japan. America wants to engage it through Quad. Look at India. America wants to engage it with
through Quad. Yeah.
Isn't it? Why? Because America is realizing that the carpet underneath is slipping. Economically, Brigadier Saab is right. China is already overtaken. And formally, in the nominal GDP,
China is no more a rising economic giant.
No,
it is risen. That is exactly.
It is an economic power. From the purchasing power parity, it is already
number
overtaken.
One. It's number one.
It is already overtaken. From nominal GDP point of view,
stands at 2.
2028 or 30, it would be number one. Okay, and it has enough reserves to invest into defense, and this is what it is doing. Brigadiers have talked of China's dominance in AI.
Sir, the interesting part was that, the Chinese would never come up with very strong statements. I remember they would always talk between the lines. But sir, if you look at the latest statements from none other than Mr. Xi Jinping, I mean, on the issue of Taiwan, you know what he said? That you will be hitting your head against the iron wall. I mean, it was a straightaway threat that don't meddle into our affairs or we will give you a very befitting response and you'll understand. And I think the Americans did.
In the international affairs, Faisal, the voice comes from your strength. Either from your military muscle or from the economic muscle. That is the either from hard power or the soft power. Isn't it? And China is probably going to be the first world power which will simultaneously attain both of them nearly together. That is the hard power and the soft power. Its soft power net is all over the world.
Indeed.
Which America has never had, even being the sole superpower in last 30 years.
So Elon Musk, the richest man on earth, believes that the Chinese are far ahead in so many areas.
Absolutely.
Like during the space war, if you remember, so the Russians were far ahead in so many areas as compared to the Americans. So if you allow me, let me also engage the lady who has joined us from Germany, Helga-Zepp Larouche. Now, coming to you, ma'am, I mean, obviously, when it comes to the Eastern European issue, or you talk about Ukraine, or you talk about Crimea for that matter, Russians have always been blamed that, the hostile takeover perhaps is what they are blamed for. But at the end of the day, ma'am, when you look at NATO in the backyard of the Russians, and I still remember when Mr. Donald Trump took charge, I mean, he said that, we will not be supporting NATO to that extent. They should support themselves, and at least 2% of the GDP should be spent on the military hardware. Even when Greece, a country like Greece was in crisis, they made sure that they should buy Rafales and other jets from France for that matter. So, ma'am, looking at this equation, I mean, obviously, Europeans would like to, have peace in the region. But there are certain areas, like as I earlier mentioned, like Ukraine or Crimea perhaps. These are the areas where there is a problem. And on top, now the Ukrainian leadership really wants NATO to help them. What sort of help are they looking at, ma'am?
Well, they have been looking for, NATO troops to be deployed inside Ukraine. I think you have to go back to what happened in 2014, because the narrative which is now being peddled by NATO and a lot of media and so forth is that, Russia was the aggressive force changing the borders of Europe, taking the Crimea. But the reality is that Victoria Nuland, who was the number 2 in the State Department at that time, she was bragging that the State Department spent $5 billion in Ukraine pushing regime change. And what happened in 2014 was a Western-backed Nazi coup, whereby, people who go back to the tradition of Stepan Bandera, who collaborated with the Nazis in the Second World War, were actually brought into the government. So then the action in the Crimea was that the people in Crimea who were afraid of, measures suppressing the Russian culture, the Russian language, they voted to be part of Russia. Now, this wrong narrative, I think, is urgent to be corrected, because as long as it's being peddled that Russia was the aggressor in this, when in reality, the happenings on the Maidan were an effort to basically move NATO closer to the borders of Russia, I think this has to be urgently corrected, because tomorrow there will be a NATO meeting. They probably will go for new sanctions. Avril Haines, who is the National Director of Intelligence of the United States, was just in Brussels telling the Europeans and the NATO ambassadors that Russia would attack Ukraine very shortly this winter. I mean, where should this all end? The reality is, when Biden and Putin met in Geneva a couple of weeks ago, they finally agreed that nuclear war cannot be won and therefore should never be fought. However, you still have the statement of Admiral Richards, who is the head of the US Strategic Command, who in February of this year instructed the Pentagon that nuclear war had become likely, while before it was categorized as not likely. So the question really is, where should this all end? And you see right now what you mentioned already, a geopolitical confrontation against both Russia and China. With Russia, it's over Ukraine. With China, it's over Taiwan. But what is really behind that is something quite different. And I would like to add to what has been said by the two gentlemen already as the reason. Yes, China is rising. All of Asia is clearly moving ahead, and that has changed the dynamic. But I think that what is underneath it is that China, with the Belt and Road Initiative, also has started to give the developing countries, for the first time in history ever, a perspective to overcome poverty and underdevelopment. And that comes at a point, when the Western liberal system, which did not ever develop the developing countries, but left them in a colonial state of underdevelopment, when they are reasserting what they call the Great Reset, or the Green Deal in the United States, or in the EU, or the Green New Deal in the United States. And that is basically the idea to completely change the financial system by investing only in green technologies, by only going into renewables, by going out of fossil fuels. And for the developing countries, this would mean absolutely no development, which is why at the COP26 summit just now at Glasgow, India, Indonesia, Nigeria, all of these countries did not go along. And China said for them, energy security is the priority and not the climate. So what we see right now is a clash between those forces, headed by China, who want to develop the developing sector, who go with the perspective of eliminating poverty, of overcoming underdevelopment, and those forces who still want to keep the colonial order of the world, which are, really headed by the British Empire. And people think the British Empire no longer exists, but that is not true, because the British Empire just has changed its colors. It's now located in a financial oligarchy, concentrated in the city of London and in Wall Street, and unfortunately also to a certain extent in Frankfurt. And these are the people who want to keep the system of speculation, of profit maximization, and keep the world population, limited, or even reduce it if it needs be. So the real conflict is between those forces. And Kurt Schwab, the leader of the World Economic Forum of Davos, in his newest book has written it in the most glaring form. This book is called Stakeholder, and there he says, the problem is that the effort to eliminate poverty is what destroys the climate. So from this standpoint, given the fact that they have a perspective of preventing development, this is the clash. And I think this is a dimension which I think is very urgent to be taken into account. And it has to be discussed openly, because what these people are pushing is so much against the interest of the vast majority of the human species that it absolutely must be defeated.
All right. Now, sir, let's go 30 years back, sir. 1991, the year when Soviet Union got disintegrated, and eventually we ended up seeing so many countries, especially the Muslim countries. When you talk about the South, you talk about the west of Russia or the east of Europe, so you're talking about certain Baltic states and so on and so forth. Now, sir, I just want to understand one thing. Now, what are the objectives of the Russians, whether you talk about Ukraine or you talk about Syria, Crimea, and even if you remember, sir, JCPOA, that P5+1 formula, that was, I think, a great win-win situation for all the countries, and eventually, I mean, we all know what happened to it. So there are a lot of areas, sir, where the Russians really supported the logic, but the Americans, you know, they did something else. As you know, as they say, might is right. Why the Americans can only put sanctions on countries like China or Russia? I mean, they're not kids or jokes for that matter. How do you see that?
Look, I think when the great powers, and over a period of time you say a game of chess between the two great powers, when one loses, they don't accept that, and in the next game they want to
Dominate.
go for a
Checkmate.
checkmate. You know, so when I read the history, or you read the history, you see that this thing repeating time and again. You know, you're talking of Afghanistan. You see, first the Britishers came over there, and before that, you know, Chandragupta Maurya and all. So this is the problem of the great powers, whether it's America, Romans, or you know, Russians, or you talk of any big. They always want to come back. They always want to,
because they have tasted that glory.
Oh yes, they always want to achieve the lost glory which they have lost. So Russia is at times, as you have said, is very, very logical to the thing. But the Americans in the last 30 years, although I say now they are tamed to some level with the passage of time, but this, as we discussed previously also, this will keep on going. And Russia wants that its border should remain secured, in my personal view. The NATO should not interfere in its western border, where you know they have Budapest and all have history of espionage and intelligence gathering even before the First World War. So
Austro-Hungarian Empire you're talking
the
about.
Second thing is, although Russia is not as economically strong as it is, but it has come out of that quagmire, economic quagmire, I would say, in which it was when it was disintegrated, and wants to go on a smooth run after some time. So they wants to take time, absorb the issue, and wants to go along with the Americans as long as their national interest, allows it. The third thing is that NATO, which is a strong ally of the Russians, Americans, is in no shape, I would say, at that moment, because there is difference between intention and capability. Intention is achieving a thing, capabilities.
They've also tasted all that in Afghanistan.
You have the resources. That's what I want. That if you have the resources and have the intentions, that becomes your capability. So, it is a compulsion of the European Union to stay in allies with the US, because they cannot do anything
Against the will and wish of the Americans.
Yes.
Yeah. Now, something very important that has been mentioned. I mean, when you talk about the Europeans, I mean, it's a very interesting mix out there, sir. Brexit or no Brexit, initially we used to talk about that. Now, sir, looking at the current equation, when the French are not happy with the Americans, especially after the formation of AUKUS and that deal of the 8 nuclear operated submarines, perhaps the the French wanted that they should deliver those. But anyway, $50–60 billion project gone. By the same time, when you look at a couple of other developments in the region, you talk about the Germans, very wise approach. You talk about the Scandinavians, they have their own area of interest. You talk about the Eastern European countries, whether Hungary, Romania, they haven't, their alignment is totally towards their west, their east rather, the west of the Russians. And then, sir, this COVID-19 has really, squeezed so many countries as far as their economic strength was concerned. So many people lost jobs. And sir, at the end of the day, what we have realized, no matter how many weapons you have, but if you are not viable as far as your economy is concerned, you stand nowhere. This is exactly what we witnessed in 1991 after the attack in 1979 on Afghanistan by the Soviet Union. And we all know what happened. So, sir, looking at that kind of a scenario, don't you think the European Union perhaps should be wise enough to take their own decisions and, have something of their own rather than totally, following the dictations of the American?
I think we are already seeing it, and that is one reason of Brexit perhaps, because European Union is managed by Germany and the second tier
after the exit
France.
of the British.
I mean, even when the British were there, it was the German Chancellor Merkel who was really dictating how to.
She was calling the shots, yes?
She was calling the shots, isn't it? And France, to some extent, I mean, people can say on his piece, but it is the Germans. And the day Germans decide to go their way, there will be no European Union. Okay? Coming back to your original question, and as the Brigade Sabal said, these the great empires, they remain attached to their history, their glorious past. And we must not forget Mackinder's heartland theory and Spyman's rimland theory. Whosoever controls the rimland controls the world. Whosoever controls the heartland will control the world. And there is only one empire who is sitting right in the center, and that is the Russian Empire. Isn't it? Because China is also on the periphery and Americans are too far off. So Russians cannot, they have already suffered enough with their breakup. So they would like to extend their perimeters under any circumstance, and that is
so
why
a person
they've
like
gone
Vladimir Putin, I mean, I think a lot of Russians do believe that the best thing ever happened to Russia is Vladimir Putin. I mean, he's a very strong man, former head of KGB, prime minister, president, army officer, intelligence, chief and all. I mean, that man means business, and he is not going to take any dictation from anyone.
This is the main difference between the two poles. The system of governance. There is consistency. In Russia, the guy is there for last 20 years, is going to be there for next 14 years. Isn't it?
So the case is with Xi Jinping.
That is what I am coming at. And
No,
that is what the
sorry for China is going toward this system.
that's what the China is going for, isn't it? But in the democratic world, it is 4 years, 4 years, 4 years, 4 years, and things keep changing. Trump came up with a lot of prophecies that he is not from the run-of-the-mill politician. He is not from the system. He is an outsider and will change everything, isn't it?
Correct.
But he could not continue, isn't it? Even for the second term, he couldn't continue because the establishment over there is so strong.
They did not let him win the next election.
They did not let him win the election, isn't it? So America, for the first time since the World War II actually, is facing two enemies concurrently. It has never faced so. Now it has to say that we have two adversaries, which it never wanted. It always wanted one adversary or one enemy at a time.
A country
But
like
now it
America,
has
can they have two fronts open, like when you say Cold War? There is a Cold War between China and Russia. There is a, between China and USA and USA and Russia.
Now, with the introduction or let's say the weaponization of space, it will not
So
remain
beginning
cold.
of the multipolar world.
Yes, no, it will not remain cold. Look at the Chinese advancement into space. They've carried out the hyperglide weapon test. Americans are still puzzled that how has China done it? I mean, they were thinking that they are competing in space with Russia. They never imagined that China would overtake both of them, isn't it?
Absolutely, they outclassed them.
It will not remain cold. It will not remain cold. Americans are threatening China in the South China Sea. Americans are threatening
The
Taiwan
eastern
Straits.
side also on Taiwan issue. You talk about the South China Sea. Obviously, they have a lot of presence there.
And as you know, the China's tone has started to change,
Absolutely.
isn't it? Why? Because they are feeling the strength in their
They
muscles.
took time. They took about 40 years and now they're in a position to say so.
it happens.
Now, last couple of minutes for you, ma'am, Helga. Now, first of all, ma'am, what do you see happening, let's suppose, in the next 3 to 4 years as far as European Union is concerned, as far as the rivalry between the Chinese and the Americans are concerned, especially in the area of South China Sea, the kind of deployment we have seen of the Americans. And then again, one statement coming out from none other than the President of America, Mr. Biden, that the security of Taiwan is our responsibility. Initially, they never had a pact of any sort regarding that. And secondly, man, when it comes to Russia, I mean, there are so many areas where they have rivalry. And I still remember being a NATO member of the, Turkey being the NATO member, shot down one of the Russian jets. And what happened after that? There were constant bomb blasts in so many big cities. They lost around, $10 billion worth of only tourism takes place in Turkey from Russia. You talk about the job and the employment, the Turkish who are working inside Russia. And then last but not the least, just look at the kind of dependence of energy on the Russians. They again renegotiated. So Russia can always twist the arm of any country that goes against their wish and will.
Well, I think we should be very clear that if it comes to a hot war, either over Ukraine or over Taiwan, the danger is that it will go nuclear. At least in the case of Taiwan, the PLA has said very clearly that if it comes to an independence of Taiwan, then the red line is passed and it will come to war and the PLA will win that war. And Daniel Ellsberg of the Watergate fame said that there should be a whistleblower in the Pentagon to reveal what is the discussion in the Pentagon about the use of nuclear weapons in that case. If it ever would come to the use of only one nuclear weapon, it is the nature of nuclear war that all weapons would be used, and that would be the annihilation of the human species because of a nuclear winter. So that should be the first starting point, that we absolutely cannot have war. And I think all countries should really work together to move to a new paradigm. Because if we do not leave geopolitics was the reason why we had 2 world wars in the 20th century, and the ideas of Mackinder are still popular in some quarters. This is the prescription for an absolute disaster which mankind may not survive. And President Xi Jinping has given a very good idea of what the new paradigm can look like. He calls it the shared community for the destiny of mankind, or for the joint future of humanity. And I think we have to really concentrate on what are the common aims of mankind. Let me just say, we are still in the middle of a pandemic. The news about a new variant coming from maybe South Africa, maybe some other place, which could be more contagious and possibly more deadly, that's not yet established. But as long as we do not have a modern health system in every single country, there is the danger of new mutations, of new pandemics. There's no guarantee that COVID-19 is the last one, quite to the contrary. And we must, as a human species, find the moral fiber in us to concentrate first on the common aims of mankind. The fight against COVID is one. Vaccination for every country. A modern health system in every country. Modern health system means modern hospitals. They need electricity, clean water, infrastructure. We have to take this crisis, which is gigantic, as a starting point to get serious about a new world economic order which allows the development of all nations on this planet. And I think that everything will depend on if we can convince the United States and China to work together, because if that conflict cannot be overcome through such a perspective, then the fate of humanity looks very dark. So all countries and all forces in all countries who have a desire.
All right, ma'am. Thank you so much. Since we're totally running out of time, but what a pleasure to have you, ma'am. Thank you so much for your presence. Brig Saab, thank you so much for your presence as well, sir. And thank you so much, Zia Saab, for participating in the show. And that's all we have for this hour. I'll see you again, inshallah, tomorrow at 8:05. Till then, you take good care. Khuda Hafiz.